Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce Dan Gregory from CBI. Go ahead, Dan.
Thanks, Matt. So thanks everybody again for coming out. Today we're going to talk about a very specific topic here. It's dark data. We're going to talk about the risks associated with it, and also the values that can be derived from knowing more about your dark data, where it is, where it's hiding, how to find it, and specifically we're going to talk about a service that we can actually provide and have developed specifically within CBI that's designed to do all of those things and turn it over to you. So myself, as well as Jeff Goreski, we're going to walk you through some of those things. I'm going to target more the first portion of the presentation, and then I'll hand it over to Jeff to talk about some very specific risk and value items around the legalities and some of those other compliance-related issues with dark data. So here we go. So a quick agenda. We're going to define dark data, what it is. It's important for everyone to know the definitions here. The word dark data is being thrown around a lot. We want to make sure that you understand the definition as we've defined it, which will help you understand all the other components of the presentation that I was just talking about. Again, risk and value. It isn't all bad. There's lots of value to be derived in understanding and being able to mine the dark data and the value, the intrinsic value from the dark data. Again, we're going to go over that dark data assessment that I mentioned that we developed, and then I'll hand it off to Jeff Goreski to discuss the importance around the legal risks associated with dark data. First, some numbers and some information that might be new to some of you. In recent reports from Gartner, about 20% of an organization's data is mission critical. It might be a little bit lower than you might have thought, but when you step back to really think about it, all the activity, all the communications, and all of the busyness that goes into running your organizations, about 20% of that, if you were to remove that mission or actually go looking for the mission critical data, it would be only about 20% of it. Okay, there's a lot of, 80% prep and 20% execution. So 80% of the data is just in preparation to create that remaining 20%, which is mission critical to the organization. So it kind of makes sense when you look at it that way. 30% of it is redundant. I personally think that number is a bit low in my experience, and having done this for a number of years, we find that there's a lot of duplicate data and redundant data. It isn't just an exact copy, it's many, many, many versions with just very subtle changes from one version to the next that can be examined and possibly removed to reclaim space in your network or in your organization's storage networks. 50% of it, there's an indeterminate value. We're going to get into that and how we can actually determine the value and find out which bucket it really goes into. Is it critical, or is it redundant, or is it something that we can just simply purge? So most organizations, they save it all. Like the statement says, it's true. We're worried that we're going to get rid of something that we shouldn't have gotten rid of, and if we do, how do we get it back, and can we get that back? So they just continue to grow and grow and grow and grow. Well, there's cost, there's resources, and there's other impact that severely impacts the level of risk to your organization, which we're going to get into. So let's start off with, like I said, some definition. Unstructured data, okay? Information that either does not have to be predefined data model, or it's not organized in a predefined manner. Okay, so it's unstructured. It's your emails, it's your text files, it's Excel, spreadsheets, Word documents. It's majority of what actually makes up the data on any given network. It's very unstructured. Think about it this way. It's anything that's not in a database. That's kind of one quick way to look at it. Okay, unstructured information is typically very text heavy, like I mentioned. Okay, it's going to contain very random information in an unstructured fashion. Think of an email, okay, or all data that is hand typed or written or organized, copied, moved by an actual person and not an actual process or a thing. That actually helps define what unstructured data is. And as you can imagine, there's an awful lot of it out there. So having defined unstructured data, the following definition makes a little more sense. So the untapped value of that or your organization's unstructured data when viewed through the lens of, and you can fill in, the remaining bullet points at the end of that sentence, depending on where you're at in your organization, your responsibility to the organization, who you interact with. We all look at that data in a different way. Audit would obviously look at that information in a completely different way than maybe IT security might, or information intelligence, business impact analysis, or parts of the organization and such. So it all is important, but it's all viewed differently through different lenses. So that's what the dark data is. How do we get that value from all that unstructured data and what it's trying to tell us. Okay, so we're going to go and actually try to listen to it and have it tell us a story. Where is it? What type of information is it? What can we do upon determining its value? And is it already stored somewhere else, or maybe many other locations at the same time? So we get into this. Where is all of it? Okay. Think about it this way. I'm going to give you a few examples, and I'm sure as a group, if we were to kind of do some group think here, we could come up with pages of this. So just to kind of get the ball rolling, it can be stored on any location on your network, your local hard drives, intranet, SharePoint servers, your inbox, which I'm sure we all use and abuse, removable media of any kind, the cloud. The list would go on and on and on. So this actually is a multiplier for both the risk and the value factors of dark data. Wrapping your hands around and comprehending where all the data could be is sometimes a very daunting task. So something else to keep in mind as we go through this in defining dark data and where it may be and the risks or value that it's actually going to bring. So then ask yourself these hard questions, okay? What do you actually know about it, okay? What types of files do I have access to? It's a simple question, but it's very difficult to answer because most cases you're not going to actually know all the data that you do have access to. Sometimes you stumble across little pockets or bits of information on the network, for example, that you didn't think you had access to. So knowing the actual exact answer to that question is sometimes difficult. How many duplicate files are there? How much space are those files consuming? And the list goes on and on. How old is it? How can I calculate the cost of the storage behind all that data? This generally involves, answering these questions would involve pulling in many, many aspects of the organization, different business units, certainly portions of IT risk management, storage management, and such, to really get close to answering and getting the true response to all those questions. Okay, they're very difficult, obviously, but as the last line states, it's very worth asking all these questions for the following reasons, and we're going to get into those. Before we get a little bit further into this, let's look at the associated risks of not knowing the answers to those questions, right? So, extended backups. If we continually add more and more and more files to our infrastructure and all of our storage units, wherever they may be, and never reclaim the space, clean up old or duplicate files, files that haven't been accessed in a long time, or ascertain who has access to what, we're going to continue extending the amount of time that it takes to back up all of what that 20% critical data really is. So, as most organizations do, they tend to over backup files or back up way more than they need to be overly cautious. Because we're all generally risk averse when it comes to data and security, we tend to overdo it. Well, I'll back up everything just in case. Well, the good stuff is in there somewhere. We'll just have to go back and reclaim it someday if we ever do need it. And in that case, I hope I don't ever have to actually go and rely on my backups because I'm not quite sure I've actually got enough time to back up all the data that I really need. So eventually, you're going to run out of the most precious commodity we have on the planet, and that's time. You only have so much of it. The inability to recover those files obviously is a side effect of your backup windows not being large enough. There's auditory risk, which again, Jeff Goreski is going to delve into much deeper here in the latter parts of the presentation. Liability concerns, increased data breach targets, then additional or unneeded storage costs as you increase your data footprint. I want to go back to one there really quick, that data breach targets. The more data you have, the more you spray it around, the more times you copy it, and the longer you keep it without backing it up and then purging and reclaiming the space, increases your data breach targets. If you were infiltrated, or if there was some sort of malware or some sort of process running inside your infrastructure that is designed to look for valuable data, if you limit the number of targets, then you're going to limit your risk associated with that type of exposure. Simply letting things grow and duplicate and continuing to expand without going and reclaiming that is going to, work against you, is basically what that one bullet point is actually trying to pull out. So I wanted to redefine that one a little more clearly. So assessing the dark data. What can we do about it, right? Now that we've defined it, we've got some terminology on the table, we've got some questions that are kind of difficult to answer out there from the presentation. Let's talk about how CBI can actually kind of help you at least address some of those questions in a very specific and concise manner, and then drive value in the actual way that it presents it back through different lenses to different audience members that we might present these assessment results back to. So we're just adding the word assessment to the word dark data. You can read Gartner's definition, or you can read our definition as being the ability to gather actionable intelligence, very important there. So we want to have actionable intelligence, do something about it, via the assessment of your organization's, again, unstructured data. There's that word, and we defined that earlier. So it's a way of wrapping your hands around the unknown and finding both risk and value through the act of a dark data assessment. I'm going to go on and define what the program is, what it looks like, and how it addresses a lot of the questions that I've been asking the group. It's also important to know, before we move forward, that we actually have a very structured process around this, as we do with everything that we actually execute internally and externally at CBI. You can read it from left to right there, but during a dark data assessment, we're going to focus on just those first three: discovering and identifying the need, documenting those needs, assessing and performing the actual dark data assessment itself, gathering the results from the assessment, and then presenting that back to you in meaningful ways, like I said, through the different lenses to those different audience members that need to see that information. Then we discuss next steps. Can we provide assistance? Can we provide recommendations and be very prescriptive in an approach? Or can we perform knowledge transfer training? Or simply just actually providing the awareness through the reports and the results? Is that going to be enough to help you drive that actionable intelligence or those actionable next steps? So let's delve down into those first three a little bit deeper. Like I said, we're going to identify the need for dark data assessments. Just because the word data is in the actual terminology, dark data assessments, I don't want people to get the idea that it is data focused only, or storage management focused only, or maybe I just want to talk to the guys that are handling the backups and limit it to that group. It's much, much more than that, because data actually has a component of storage management and restoration and discovery and things of that nature, of course, but it also impacts and is impacted by security controls. Who has access to this data? Is it overly accessible? Things of that nature. So it actually has a very strong security component associated with it as well. So we're identifying the need by gathering all the people in the organization that may potentially be impacted by and want to view the results through their own lens. Like I mentioned a few slides prior, everybody from financial to audit, certainly the executive teams, directors, IT analysts, security people, storage management, the list will go on. So we're identifying the need and having everybody chime in and throw their hat in the ring saying, I want to see the results, because the results are going to mean something different to me than they would for everybody else. So it's a very important first step. Then we do the pre-engagement scoping calls. We let you know how the program works, where we're going to actually analyze the data, where that data is, how much of it we're going to be able to analyze in the actual time allotted to the actual dark data assessment. And I'm going to get into the amount of time here in a few slides, how long these actually assessments do last. We'll deliver a hardened appliance, which we've created at CBI. It's proprietary in nature and is designed to deliver this assessment service in a very specific way, very easy for you to adapt to. Plug it in, scan, and then return the appliance is the quick version of it, but I'll expand on that in just a moment. Then the reports are presented, the locations of dark data, where it might exist, and getting the actual risk and value from that. Identifying areas of storage optimization, retention and retrieval classification of data and things of that nature all kind of flow from those reports. It's very organic and it's ad hoc, and we can create reports in real time in front of the actual audience members, either on-site or remotely, as we kind of go through and analyze the results. So that's a high-level view of the actual dark data assessment itself, broken down by phase. So a little bit more on the impact and the outcomes. What we're actually presenting, like I said, is going to impact a lot of different people in different parts of the organization. I've only outlined a few here, but these are worth kind of mentioning a little bit deeper. So from the information management and intelligence groups within the organization, you're going to be interested in knowing about the enterprise vaulting of data and file system archiving. Where do we need to aim those efforts? We found a bunch of aged data. It's very old, hasn't been touched in a long time. Can we vault it? Can we archive it and get it off and reclaim that very expensive Tier 1 or Tier 2 storage space, back again and repurpose it? Enterprise backup and recovery. Again, those windows we talked about, either shortening those windows and focusing only on the data that matters. And then, of course, storage management. From a data management process and policy procedural development portion of it, it'll actually aid in the data classification, because a dark data assessment is also designed to help you identify the types of data you have, where that data is, and how much of each of those different types of data you actually are storing. So it will help with data classification and provide visibility into that process of data classification. It is not the data classification process in and of itself. It is an enhancer to an ongoing data classification program. Data mitigation and migration and consolidation. If you are considering moving large portions of your organization's data from one platform to another, perhaps maybe internally to the cloud or vice versa, whatever it may be, you also want to make sure that you're not moving more than you have to. So just as if you're moving from one home to another, there's never a better time than to clean out the house, clean out the closets, the attic, and the basement spaces to make sure you're not moving any more than you actually have to. Dark data assessments can help out with those. Controls assessments and enforcements. Something that we also specialize in is actually regulatory compliance and controls-based assessments and enforcements. Certain policies and procedures you have would be or may be actually impacted by the results of a dark data assessment. Finally, the last section outlined here is information governance and security. Perhaps you want to have an ongoing dark data assessment program designed to make sure that you maintain that level of control over the dark data in your environment. Certainly you can do that. Any data loss prevention programs, making sure that information isn't being leaked out into areas where it shouldn't be. Dark data assessment scans can actually ensure that that data isn't falling into storage areas on the network and outside the network where it doesn't belong. And then, of course, identity access management. I mentioned once already before that we want to make sure that not too many people have access to information, or nobody rather has access to information that they shouldn't be allowed to access. This can also be used to supplement or enhance identity access management programs. So it has a lot of tentacles that would reach into and support and enhance other areas of the business than might be readily available at face value. So we want to make sure that you understand the value of dark data assessment. So the actual providing visibility portion, like I mentioned before, and I'm going to go through this slide and the next one pretty quickly because I've already talked about them a little bit, and you can read through these sections here. We talk about data aging reports that we can get, and you can see the target audience there, and then some use cases listed beneath the actual aged data reports. Locating data that has not been touched in a very long time, reclaiming the space, helping with data classification, retention, and retrieval programs and such. The next one down below there is consumption by file group, literally meaning how much space are those files consuming on my network by group. So how many JPEGs, Excel spreadsheets, zip files, VMDKs, zip, the list would go on and on. Different types of files do I have, classify them by type, and then show me how much each of those, how much space each of those file groupings or types is actually consuming. The next one here, like I said, I'm going to go through pretty quick. Inactive file groups, okay, or inactive files by group, rather. It's going to show that how you can better utilize the data storage and eliminate orphaned and stale data that simply isn't being used anymore. There's an awful lot of it out there, and it grows every minute and every second of every day. User group permissions. Okay, you actually can run it on a single individual or groups of individuals and show what types of permissions they have and what type of data they have access to. Locating data at risk and investigate those risks based on excessive access, perhaps, and making sure that people don't have access to more information than they need. And these would go on and on. I just wanted to point out some of the more important ones here, or the more impactful ones. When we're done doing this actual dark data assessment, you're presented with, in near real time, graphs and charts that will allow different groups of individuals, the ones that I mentioned before, the ability to view the results through their own lens. Generally, pictures are worth 1,000 words, so we go towards graphics. Pie charts here that would show the age data. You can see here that we have a large portion of data that is older than 12 months. We could actually show data going back to the beginning of the beginning. So if you have files that are out there that haven't been touched in 7, 8, 9, 10 years, as long as they're still on your network, we can scan for those and show you how much of those, how much space those files are actually consuming. Inactive data. This is data that has not been touched, modified in a given amount of time. So if it lays dormant for a long period of time, you obviously want to reclaim that. Backup files, archive files, executables, or applications that have been installed but are no longer being used. The list will go on, and it's different for every organization that we perform a dark data assessment against. But this graph here is generally representative of the spread or the distribution of different file types that we find in an average inactive data dark data assessment. A data analysis, one of my favorites. So it'll show you, break them down by file type, how much space those file types are actually consuming. This one doesn't show it here, but we generally find a lot of VMDKs, or those virtual machines that are laying around that haven't been used. They are very large generally, and they take up a lot of space. Those can be reclaimed and removed, purged, archived, what have you, and generally return a lot of space. ISOs, binary files, installation files. We've all done it. We've installed applications and then left the actual ISOs and binaries just laying all over the place just to consume space. Well, they're pretty much outdated the second that the newest version of that application comes out, but we never go back and actually take the time to purge them. And then the years go by, and before you know it, you have a bloated network that's full of applications and files that just don't belong there. And you're backing them up on tape, in the meantime in some cases. Inactive data by file type. I apologize, I know this is a bit of an eye chart for some of you, but you can see the second one down is your backup and inactive files. It shows you the actual amount of space being consumed by those backup and inactive files. And then user access summary, another very important one. By user account, it will show you the most active users on your network, meaning who's modifying, creating, deleting, moving, copying, etc. files more so than any other user. So it allows you to target those very active users in different ways. If you have DLP infrastructure in place, for example, you could use these types of data and reports to actually enhance and reduce false negatives and false positives for your policy-driven DLP programs. And that's just one example of many. So there's a lot of value in these types of reports as well. So to kind of wrap up my portion of the presentation here before I hand off to Jeff Goreski, I wanted to kind of recap the areas where things can be improved. So the value, right? We haven't just talked about the bad stuff. I want to actually include some of the good things. So dark data assessments and just understanding dark data in general will help with the following areas. Improving data management, obviously. Okay, discovering and being able to clean up stale and orphan data, cleaning up your expensive tier 1, tier 2 storage, either in preparation for data migrations or additional purchases that you might be considering. If you do a dark data assessment prior to that activity, you might find out that you can either delay or come up with other creative ways of reclaiming space without having to invest in very expensive data storage. The next one is achieving compliance. A lot of those we already talked about. And Jeff Goreski is definitely going to drill down more into this area. But being able to identify who actually owns the information, who's owning the data because they're touching it more so than anybody else. An example would be, let's say I create an Excel spreadsheet, and I did that 2 years ago. But John Smith down the hallway touches it 1,000 times a week because he's using and managing and actually is the steward or owner, the inferred owner of that actual Excel spreadsheet. We would actually go down the hallway to talk to John Smith, or Joe Smith rather, versus Dan Gregory. If we wanted to actually find out who's using the file, why they're using it, why is it important and being used more so than maybe perhaps some other data on the network. Again, it would help in DLP classification, data classification as well. Protecting your data from security risks. The longer you leave data laying around, the more targets you have. This gets back to something I mentioned early on in the presentation. By reducing that footprint, those breach targets, for example. The fewer targets there are, the harder they have to find, search to find actual valuable data. If it's laying around, it's been copied and duplicated, and it's sprayed all over your network, they're going to have a very easy time of getting a hold of something that is valuable to them in some way, shape, or form. So those are the three areas, or actually those areas are the three that we kind of boiled down the entire presentation to show the value of actually conducting those things. The dark data assessment, expectations and specifications. Remember I would hold off on telling you how long the actual dark data assessment lasts until this slide. That is not a typo. It is designed to be executed in 8 hours. It's an appliance. Like I said, we've got it down to a very regimented process where we deliver it. You plug it in with a power network cable, we scan a selected portion of your infrastructure, and then we present results back, all within about 8 hours of effort. It generally spans 2 to 3 days because we have to account for logistics and the shipping of the actual appliance and then getting it back from you. but the actual effort that's expended only generally lasts about 8 hours. That includes the scanning, cultivating of data, and creating of the actual reports themselves. We focused on specific use cases, all of which I've mentioned here in this presentation. It runs without agent, and we ask you for very little. We ask you for a power and network cable and a read-only account on your network that we can authenticate this device to your network. We do not move or copy any data of any kind. We're only actually just gathering attribute data and metadata from the files themselves so that we can generate the reports on the appliance. So it's very tight, it's very concise, and it's very specifically aimed at adding value by finding both the risk and the value of your dark data. And it's all done in about, like I said, about 8 hours. That's my portion of the presentation, defining dark data, some structure, how the program works, and the value and risk statements around dark data. I'm going to hand it off to Jeff Goreski now, so he can talk to you a little bit more about the legal risk of around and concerning dark data. So, Jeff, if you want to take it away, it's all yours.
Fantastic, Dan. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. The takeaway from this entire presentation: put Mr. Gregory's number on speed dial. That is a man who brought some incredible information to us in the first part of this presentation. Let's take a look at the legal risk. We all know about dark data, and Dan made some wonderful points. Do we know that date is not the only basis to consider data dark? Imagine you have a marketing campaign that you're putting together, and the 12 drafts that have either inaccurate information, have information on them that potentially might be bad reputationally if it got out, before you tweak it for the final. And that data sits there, and 10 minutes after you produce the final, all of those working papers, all of those drafts are dark data. They should not be around, and they can potentially bring risk should they get out. In this world, we have the Internet of Things. You've all heard of that now. Far beyond servers, laptops. Now we're talking ephemeral devices, shadow IT, a myriad of things happening. It's important to understand the risk factor of all of that data. Now, in dark data, we love to say out of sight, out of mind. It's one of the key elements that we think about. It's one of the key elements that we think about when we're talking about data, and it's so true. If that data is not directly involved daily, hourly, moment, whatever the criteria is, it can be out of mind, but the risk of having that data present is still there. So we have to look at some of the misconceptions that people see. Some organizations believe that saving all data will protect them from e-discovery penalties in the event of litigation. Saving everything is a strategy that is extremely flawed. God bless everyone in legal. They think that's the right way to do it. But reality is, and courts are ruling and making opinion, that what's important is the value of the data retention strategy and determining the strategic benefit of holding on to specific data. There are rules out. If you are in litigation, there are particular rules, like Section 26B1. Data requests have to be relevant and proportional. So what is relevant and proportional? It means any reasonably formed request. Now, how is that for not vague? Can you argue? Yes, you can. 8 ways till Sunday. What is classed as a reasonably formed request? I'm about to date myself. Your Honor, I want all data from Acme Corporation that has Lotus 123 and WordPerfect documents. Well, Your Honor, says Acme, we're not going to do that. That is not a reasonably formed request. My retort is, yes, Your Honor, they've been backing that up since 1991. So it is reasonably relevant for them to produce it. And I want it produced in a format that I can read it, because I don't have WordPerfect or Lotus 123, old versions from DOS, handy. So now you have a responsibility to do it. And if you don't, you can face sanctions, which courts love to apply. So it's very important to understand that keeping data, the type of data, holding it too long can create incredible risk in and out of litigation. Let's look at some more numbers. 50%, according to a new release that came out, 50% of stored data is classed as debris. Even back in 2012, and these numbers stay consistent, the summit confirmed 1% of corporate information was on litigation hold. 5% was in records category, and 25% had current business value. So a very small portion. 69% of information in most companies has no business, legal, or regulatory value. Yet it still exists and is still being backed up and maintained. And if you hold it, it has to be potentially called through if a request comes in. It is potentially available for e-discovery. And the other problem, some of the other problems you find on risk and exposure is failure to respond. As Dan showed, the size of data that you could potentially have that's classed as dark. Imagine trying to respond to a subpoena or notice in a timely fashion because the clock starts ticking from the time that litigation is reasonably anticipated. So it may cost thousands to millions to try to cull through the data and produce what is classed as reasonably formed request for relevant and proportionate data. And not being able to access the right files can strongly anger judges. I don't know if anybody was at Legal Tech this year in New York, but there was a lot of panel presentations of justices giving their opinion on the expeditious manner in which data needs to be produced, and based on the advancements in technologies. So the thread is getting much smaller. Even if we look back, the Clinton White House spent $10 million to pull records off of backup tapes and look at them again in light of subpoenas. So ultimately, the White House was so for failing to search certain email systems and backup tapes. So extremely costly if you fail to respond. Matter of fact, courts can actually issue rulings based on not responding to in a timely fashion. Also, sanctions and judgments that can get extremely messy. We talk about data privacy, something that's critically important as we keep referencing the Internet of Things. So the reports that have come out recently from one of the big four on their global cybersecurity assessment shows that client data is still the top target for cyber criminals. So as much as a denial of service and some of these other ones sound sexier, the gathering and the use of client data is still tops for cyber criminals. So you have a responsibility to ensure that data privacy, and any breach to that data privacy responsibility can lead to incredible penalties, costs, and sanctions. So 13 states plus Washington have passed data privacy laws requiring companies to notify consumers if their personal data has been stolen. So imagine this, hypothetically, a nursing home in one of the states has a breach. That breach has led to potential data being taken or compromised. That data not only could include current and living residents and current and living employees, it can also, from a reporting side and responsibility, include patients that have passed away and reporting to their living families, past employees. The list goes on of the exposure that is potentially possible under data privacy. And of all the things that we should take extremely seriously is data privacy. One of the key trends on that to show how serious it is that federally there are rules, but now states are imposing their own level, which in some cases supersedes federal requirements. We also talk about regulatory. So compliance with regulatory and data retention policies is critical. There is a majority of organizations that we have seen that have a policy. Some, it's clean, cut, and they adhere to it. Others, it's more loose. How's that for the right phrase? More loose. We'll use it. And in other words, they have a general policy, but they create their own exceptions. We're supposed to get rid of all email data that is not on legal hold 6 months or 2 years or 7 years from date of receive sent. Except we have all of these PSTs, NSFs, and EMLs sitting around from 13 years ago because we did a data migration. And to be on the safe side so that we don't have all of people screaming that they're missing mail, we're going to hold on to it for a period of time. Then we forget. Now it's beyond our compliance, beyond our policy. And courts will rule when people are beyond their policy, even if they may have won the matter or been ruled in favor of if they had complied with their retention policies. So data is not a game played by different rules. If you fail to address legal and regulatory risks, it can result in serious regulatory breach, fines, reputational damage, and loss of business. It is extremely critical. One of the rules in law is 37E of Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, is a sanction rule. So potentially that can be used to prove intent to deprive the other side of the information. So when this data is requested, and if you have it still, even after you should have purged it, it becomes available. And when it's available, if you do not produce it in the appropriate time frame, then you could be ruled under different sanctions like 37E. When we look at cyber threats is another very critical side that we need to look at. Organizations are working with companies like CBI, and they're not only looking at cybersecurity for their live data, they're actually using dark data analysis for cybersecurity. Again, keeping in mind that that old data may potentially show value to criminals, might be easier to get to because it potentially could be stored in a repository or a fashion that is less secure than live data, potentially overlooked. And what we have to remember is that exposure on that data loss impact could be huge. So a nonprofit healthcare provider was fined $50,000 by the Department of Health and Human Services because they lost a laptop carrying unencrypted data for 441 patients. Here's what's interesting about that. The data that was carried was all considered dark. It was beyond the time period of active data and was stored on that laptop as a, quote, user backup of the file. So it's incredible how this type of omission towards looking at the dark data can still lead to heavy fines and heavy issues. Finally, it's never the light bulb. It's the guy with the ladder that costs all the money. Productivity. If you have to get data, whether it's for a subpoena, a litigation matter, an internal investigation, or any other business reason, then it costs money to try to get it. And Dan's slide, which was so pertinent, showing you the graph of how much is on backup, how much of the data is on potentially multiple repositories, both on-premise and potentially in the cloud, like shadow IT. How do you get all of that data? It costs time, it costs money. Things that organizations should not have to be spending on dark data. So in summary, one of the most important things to do, and I'm going to throw one more at you, is look at where that data is and where the data came from. We had a situation where an organization came to us and we literally saved them because they bought 2 other companies in the past 6 years, and all of that data from those acquisitions came in, was put into their domain and forgot about. That dark data from mergers and acquisitions, that is still now the responsibility of the purchasing company. It falls under all the risks. It has to be maintained under the same value and security structure, and can impose the same sanction rules and penalties as if it was your own data originally. So critically important to avoid risk, mitigate it, and ensure it's moved.
All right. What we want to do, everybody, here is obviously it's what we're hoping to do is reach out to each one of you on the phone and have individual conversations, because like between Jeff and I, what we're trying to explain here is everybody's environment is a little bit different, and we understand that. And the way that we would approach services or discussions regarding dark data, risk mitigation and such are going to be different for each one of you. So as a result of this, we're hoping to have the opportunity to talk to each one of you. We've got some information here on this last slide on how you can contact us and keep that conversation going. Thanks for everyone for participating. I want to thank Jeff for his time as well. It's always very valuable, and I hope to be talking to all of you very soon.